I think curiosity is something that needs to be stoked. And and it's something I do all the time. And my wife does as well. I think all of my kids have, pretty positively picked up on it. And I think, sure, we get stressed at times, and it's like they ask you a question, you're like, I'll answer that later. Or, why are you asking that? But like, I think that is the moments that you get as a parent to really like answer the question and go like, well, tell me a little bit more about why you were thinking about that question and figure out how they're applying it. And I think what I've realized post-pandemic is how important these certain times of the day are for that, especially right before bed. Like if I ask my kids like right off the bus, how was your day? My daughter will tell me all about it, every single detail in chronological order. My boys like run past me to get, whatever carbohydrates in them and like watch some TV or whatever they want to do, go play in the yard. But at night, for whatever reason, and I don't think this was before we were doing the journaling, that's where it's like, hey, can I tell you something about school? And then that leads to something, and then hey, Dad, what does this mean? Or they were talking about this, or they'll say something that I'll say, do you know what that means? And then I'll say, you need to be careful about acting like you know what that means because you don't really understand it. And here's a framing point for you so you understand how others might perceive that. I'm not telling you not to say it or not to do it, but you need to understand how that fits into society's view of it, not to try to just be a fit in, but to make sure you understand where you might be crossing lines.
Yeah, that's interesting. So just this morning, I went and toured an acting academy. Do you know what acting academy is? Have you heard of that? So it's a type of school that is much more on the Socratic method of asking a lot of questions. They're not like sitting down with a teacher at a desk, making sure that all these things are done. But it's a lot of question asking, a lot of the entrepreneurial skills, a lot of life skills that are implemented into it. Some of them will have like full kitchens where you're learning. It's not like an artsy type of thing where hey, we all need to learn how to be cooks. But like, hey, if that's what you're interested in, then go cook today. No big deal. Like if you want to learn about how to change the oil in a car, then we can figure that out. Like let's learn together. But they have like little business ventures that the kids will create, and they'll have like little sales around Christmas time. Like, hey, this is the business I created. This is the product I created. Here's my pitch for you to buy it. And like these kids are learning about all of these different things. And it was started by a couple entrepreneurs out in Austin, and it has grown up quite a bit since then. So in GoBundance is where I learned about it, with a bunch of guys in GoBundance have their kids in these acting academies. So I was there today, and they were like, look, the most uncomfortable part about this type of school is the parents, because the parents are so used to what society has said we should be teaching our kids. And honestly, if a kid is asking the question, they're probably ready to learn it. Yeah. Like it's one of those, like, what do you know? Like the kid is interested. Why, and I underlined this 3 times, put a star next to it when you said that curiosity needs to be stoked. And like, I picture that purely as a fire. Like too many times curiosity in our kids is stamped out so that the fire doesn't start and doesn't get out of control, rather than let's let that spark fly. Let's keep the curiosity going and let it build into a legitimate fire. Because I think the curiosity fire can go out. It can turn into a wildfire. Don't get me wrong, and burn down a lot of acres, right? Yes, especially with the internet, it could take you a lot of ways. But man, oh man, if you can like guide the curiosity to those directions, like I mean, there's no way the kid can't stop learning. Like they're just going to keep going. So
I want to kind of tap into 2 things with that. One is my mom's best friend and her husband started a school called the Harmony School in Bloomington, Indiana. And I don't know whether it fits into the Acton Academy structure, but I know that they have been, heralded with awards around the country for these free-form school concepts. And I'd been to that school as a middle schooler, as not really a prospective student. I was like friends with the principal, but she was like, hey, come to school for a day. And like, I went to the school for a day and it was like, whoa, this is way different than like, I think it's something like if 5 students want to learn about a topic, they just start a class.
Nice.
I was like, oh, okay, that works. But there's other things like socially, there's not as many people. So like basketball is ages, 5 to 18. So, you're not going to get maybe the same level of competition on the playground. But the other thing I was going to say about that, like kind of schooling is just I think that we've got work to do on our school and our education system, and there are a lot of positives to fitting into how society forms groups and tribes and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But to your point, like, at what cost? Because if it puts out all these fires, and by the time that you actually need to decide, okay, which path am I going to go on? We've been talking about that and how these decisions come up kind of quick when you're 15, 16, 17 years old. Yeah. And like, that's right when everything's extinguished. So one thing I've done with clients when they kind of seem like they're not sure what their purpose is I ask them to do a visualization exercise, where I ask them to close their eyes and go back to when they were between the ages of 6 and 12. And I picked those years based on my reading on psychology and how like the self forms in those formative years. And I'm like, what did you love doing? What do you remember waking up with, like running out the door to go do? And, they always give me answers. And then sometimes those things are still hobbies for them, but rarely are they intertwined in their business. And we'll encourage them to it. At least if you're not doing it as part of your business, like, keep it alive, because there's a reason why you were attracted to that, I think, at that age. And, just because you weren't a kid anymore doesn't mean you shouldn't be acting like a kid anymore in those environments that like felt so pure.
Yeah. I love that question. First off, I think that's a lot of fun because you had me start to think about what it was I love to do. And it was like light fires in the woods and build things, right? Like that's what I was doing from 6 to 12. And I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I was never home. My parents never, they didn't have a clue where I was. There was no such thing, obviously, as a cell phone. But I loved it. But you said when they're getting to like 15, 16, 17 is kind of when things are starting to get stamped out. And I would like to challenge that a little bit and say, I would bet in first grade, because you mentioned it in your story in first grade, where you asked the question about who was going to rebuild those houses. And the teacher was like, let's put that on the shelf and talk about it later. Like, to me, that's almost already starting that stamping it out, because teachers, they're not equipped to be able to answer that most of the time. Let me rephrase that. They're very equipped. It's never been a part of the process for them to know how to use that tool of, okay, let me stoke this curiosity. Okay, that's a great question. Let's figure out how to answer that. Right. Because you can go down a massive rabbit hole even for a bunch of first graders. No big deal. Like, they can learn a lot just from answering that single question. But it's too many we've got things on our book thing that we have to do today that the curriculum does not.
It doesn't fit into the Maryland State assessment curriculum.
Exactly. I don't know if you know this.
You do those. You trip over it and you end up, touching some live wire related to the fact that there's a war zone that just opened up yesterday, and half these kids don't even know what a war is, and we're now talking about rebuilding in that, and there's a lot of politics baked into that, and everybody's parents a contractor because we live in the first district here around DC. Like, let's just table that. Let's just table that one.
And to me, like, that's one of the reasons I started homeschooling, is because I want to be able to answer all those questions. My kids have a lot of them. It drives my sister-in-law absolutely bonkers. Like, she doesn't like to answer that many questions. She's much more of the, okay, great, Adam, please stop asking questions. Like, and I'm like, buddy, ask as many questions as you can. My dad always told me, like, that's how little boys learn. And it was one of those, I hope he hears this, but it was one of those that, like, I could tell it would drive him crazy though too, but it was too late in his brain. He's like, dude, I already told him that's how little boys learn. How am I supposed to manage this now? Because he'd come home from a 16-hour shift and I'd have questions, and I'd want to know things. So for me, it was around that probably 12, 13-year-old range that I really started to get a lot of that stamped down. I wasn't as inquisitive. I wasn't, interested as much anymore. And it was probably because I was getting around friends and trying to be cool, and like the guy who's always asking questions and trying to learn everything is not exactly the coolest kid in the school. You know what I mean? So
you just act like you already know. Like
duh, everybody knows that. Type 3 projects, totally know those. Totally. But for those listening that don't, if you could explain it to them like they're me not understanding it,